all growth, even the growth of knowledge, all of it occurs through the correction of error. So you need new leaves, you need new skin, you need new color. It always occurs, but that's with your knowledge, that's with your company. And that gets back to the feedback mechanism that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
Trial and error, trial and error. You need the error for the growth.
Because you use that
Right.
to be better.
You need it. Yeah. I mean, a lot of entrepreneurs, they don't even care that much about positive feedback because they can't always use it as much as
Exactly.
the critical feedback.
This is Ingleside Reviews, Innovators Unveiled. And now your host, A.D. Edwards.
Now, before we dive into our entrepreneurship conversation, I'd like to take a moment and give our audience some background on Dr. Murphy so you understand why his insight carries so much weight. Dr. Patrick J. Murphy is a respected professor, thought leader, and entrepreneurship expert. He holds the Goodrich Endowed Chair at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and he's made a career out of shaping entrepreneurial ecosystems from universities and incubators to startup founders. His experience combines academic leadership, innovation, strategy, and real world impact, which makes his perspective especially valuable for entrepreneurs at any stage. Dr. Murphy, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me, AD.
So it's been quite some time since I had a chance to converse with you, and I'm glad you're on our show. I learned a lot from you when I was at DePaul University and discussing entrepreneurship. And as you know, I've always had a passion for entrepreneurship and starting businesses. And I was always wondering how these big mega corporations come into existence. So it's good to have you on the show. And when we get started, I just want to ask you a few questions about your background. I just told the audience a little bit about you. But what do you think was the catalyst to having you interested in entrepreneurship?
Man, I just never really had much patience for doing things that I don't enjoy or that I don't think are meaningful. And for something to be meaningful and for me to enjoy something, it's really the same thing, to be honest with you. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. But I developed that mindset at a very early age, and so it carried me through um, graduate degrees and going to universities in different states and just uh, doing what gave me strength and gave me energy and not doing or avoiding what took energy out of me. And I think we maybe talk about this later, but that's great advice for building an entrepreneurial career. But in my case, it took me through graduate programs and a PhD, and I didn't really even plan to be a professor until probably year 3 or 4 of my doctoral program. And then I ended up moving to DePaul University, where I was for 16 years. And then at that point, I I had a really strong education through my doctoral training, and I learned a lot about epistemology and philosophy. Epistemology essentially means it's the study of knowledge and how knowledge grows and develops, how theories are built, how theories are published, how they die, how they compete with other theories. And I've always been fascinated by that realm in philosophy, that particular domain. And at some point, when I was at the University of Illinois Chicago, working in the business school on my doctoral degree, they had a really strong, they still do have a strong entrepreneurship program, but they were a real pioneer back then. There's a lot of others out there now. And I would see entrepreneurs every single day. And at some point, I started to view those entrepreneurs like the scholars and scientists who create theories, but instead they're in the practical world creating projects and ventures which go on to live or die in the creator's stead, just like a theory can. And they compete with one another just like different theories can do. And so I essentially drew from epistemology to start explaining entrepreneurial phenomena. And that was back in like, oh gosh, 2000, 2001, 2002, and I finished in 2004. So that's where it came from for me. It came from a very scholarly place. But since then, I've done a lot of practical uh, entrepreneurial projects and ventures and helped others do that many times. So that's how I got into the role.
So you've seen a lot of entrepreneurs start, come and go, as it were. What do you think are the first critical steps every aspiring entrepreneur should take before launching a business?
Find a problem that you care about and try to think about fixing it. I think too many entrepreneurs try to sell solutions instead of fix problems. And if you sell solutions, you're not going to have the proper foundation, not only for your business, but for yourself, because a problem is going to connect with you at a deeper level and keep you focused on the work. And because you care about the problem, you'll be willing to put in 80-hour weeks or whatever it is, and it will not drain you of energy. That's where it all starts. It starts with problems. I've been doing this for over 25 years and I've worked with thousands of entrepreneurs. And when I reflect on the really successful ones, they always try to solve problems and they don't try to like find solutions and offer solutions all day long. They talk about problems and they're curious about them. So I think that's where it starts. And if you don't do that at the beginning, you're setting yourself up for moderate performance.
Okay. How can someone, they may think they have a problem and they want to solve it, so they want to start a business, but how can someone evaluate whether their business idea is truly viable or not?
Well, an entrepreneur, generally speaking, AD, won't come up with, if you're really going to get traction, the idea comes at about stage 3 of the process. If we can kind of break it down here. So when you recognize a problem, you don't really think that much about it. You kind of feel it. It's kind of like walking into a room and it's too cold in there. You don't have to go and sit down and do math problems to figure out it's too cold in the room. It hits you immediately. And problems hit you in that way, whether it's in a market or in a community, the inefficiencies that can break up a supply chain. You just gut feeling something's not quite right. Entrepreneurs need to be very alert to that kind of reaction to the world. But then after you have that, you start collecting data around that problem. And eventually you'll start to see regularities to the problem and it'll take on an objective nature. Then you have an opportunity. Then and only then does it really make sense to innovate and formulate an idea that should fit with that opportunity. Like an opportunity could be, in a very simple sense, a nail protruding from a wall. A hammer only makes sense if you have, as an idea, if you have a opportunity situation like that. If you have a hammer but there's no nail protruding anywhere or that needs to be hammered in, it's not much good. Ideas are very much like that. So to answer your question succinctly, if you have an idea that fits with an opportunity and the opportunity is reflective of an underlying problem, that's usually a good idea because you have the context for an idea. Now, many of them will fail and then you kind of rehash or recreate or reimagine the idea, but you can do that all day long and still keep the same opportunity.
Right. That makes sense. Now, many entrepreneurs, they start solo. What are some early team building strategies that actually work?
People don't contract and people don't take a formal enough approach to this particular topic. A lot of people will go on gut feeling or they'll start a business with their brother or their uncle or something like that, and they won't formalize that relationship, where they'll do it on a handshake with somebody they've known for a long time, these kind of configurations. Um, Doing a contract with somebody who's close to you or who is your kin might feel weird, but I mean, I know entrepreneurs right here in Chicago, where I am right now, who didn't talk to each other for 15 years, fathers and sons, because they had arguments over money, because they didn't formalize the relationship. If you get traction, everything changes. And if you have a disagreement about money or resources or a key decision with somebody who's close to you, like a friend or a family member, it's an even harder disagreement to work out because you're very subjective about it because they're that close to you. So you have to like treat it like a transactional like decision and have a probationary period. Put things down on paper. Even imagine like future decisions about hiring or relocation or pivots and different things like that. If and when you need to do things like that, how will those decisions be made? Meaning, who is responsible for them? How do we communicate with one another about those decisions? Doing these kinds of things on the front end can avoid a lot of problems later on. And it's a huge thing that we teach in our program is how to formally build a team in this way, uh, and make sure they have the right expertise and education and all that, but then make the relationship formal enough to protect both sides and protect the business. That's probably the best thing that one can do.
What would you say that would still apply if I've seen husband and wives start businesses together?
Yep. Do it anyway. Do it anyway. In fact, I would say do it all the more if it's your family member, because again, when you succeed big, these conversations, the logic of how you talk about the business will change qualitatively. It's a completely different conversation eventually. And because you're close to that person, you're less objective about it. You're less objective about what's going on. And it makes it all the more hard and all the more difficult to work through those kinds of things. That's the formal side of it. It's a very rich question that you've asked. The other side of it is finding people that complement what you bring to the table.
Hmm.
And I don't just mean in terms of skills and talents and education and experiences. I mean in your natural preferences as a human being. If you're the artist about this particular entrepreneurial project, you don't want to go and find another artist or creative type. You're the one that writes the songs and creates the content, if, as it were, metaphorically speaking. Famous musicians have managers for a reason.
Right.
Managers handle the gigs and the tickets and the merch and all that. And if the artist tries to do that, the art will suffer, and vice versa. If the
Yeah.
manager tries to start creating the content, the business is going to suffer and the art will suffer too. So finding that complementarity between two different types of energy, which I call the artist and the business person, is very important to building out a team when you're hiring. It's like, think of Steve Jobs. He had Wozniak behind the scenes. Steve Jobs didn't know how to code. It was Woz who knew how to do all
Right.
that stuff. Jobs was really the business person, certainly creative, but
Hmm.
when it came to like the core operational content that launched in the early days, that big company, it was Wozniak.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense to me. I know if you are, you got a few people putting something together, and you have to deal with the large staff. But if one person is an introvert and not a good people person, they may not be the best person to manage the staff. You know,
That's right.
so yeah, that I see how that's an advantage to not only skills but also personalities that you look for. Now, how important do you think it is to have a clear mission and vision from the very beginning of your concept of starting a business?
It's really important, but one has to understand that the mission evolves and develops over time alongside the venture. So earlier, when I said that it begins with problems and a problem solving orientation, when I said entrepreneurship begins there, one has to understand that problems are very much values laden. They're culturally laden. In other words, there are expectations around them. So like I mentioned, coming into a room if it's too cold, the only reason we react when a room is too cold is because we have a shared, almost like a cultural implicit expectation about the temperature of a room. We don't go around talking about it all the time,
Right.
but if reality clashes with that subtle expectation, it hits you and you don't have to think about it. That can apply to one's culture, one's personality, one's values, and everything else that makes you who you are. As a result of that, when you feel a problem in the early days, the seeds of your mission are already there.
Hmm.
The reason you care about the problem are the seeds of the mission. So later on, after you work through what I talked about earlier in terms of turning the problem into an opportunity and then innovating an idea in relation to that, and then launching a project and an operational model, at some point you have to put it into the context of a qualitative mission that's values laden. And at that point, if you started out fixing a problem, the foundations for that will be in place. And it is important to have a strong mission because think of it like a compass. A mission is like your culture. It shows you like a compass does which way is north, even when there are no landmarks around you. It's
Okay.
kind of a natural inclination versus a map, which is like your strategy. This is why culture will always beat strategy because if the environment changes, a map becomes irrelevant. If the environment changes with a compass, you can still generally tell which way north is. It
Right.
doesn't have the precise prediction, but it has this kind of forecasting. power. That's what your mission does for you. And it enables you to scale, because the only way to say no to a deal that may be good financially, but bad culturally for your business is if you have a strong mission. Not all money is the same in this entrepreneurial world. And if you have a strong sense of why you're doing what you're doing, not just what you're doing, but why you're doing what you're doing, it gives you a calculus for saying no to things that you should say no to, even if they look good on the surface.
What are some common misconceptions that students or first time founders may have about entrepreneurship?
They think you have to invent something or come up with something brand new. I think the vast majority of entrepreneurs, they launch a business in relation to something else that already exists. It's kind of like, I don't know, think of it like a gold rush. Nobody gets rich in a gold rush except people who sell things to the miners, right? Maybe
Yeah.
1 out of 500 miners is going to strike it rich, but the ones who are selling pickaxes and shovels and pans and jeans and boots
Hmm.
to all those miners are the ones who make money. And so right there, that's a very entrepreneurial kind of scenario, but they're doing it in relation to other, you could call them entrepreneurial
Right.
actors. And so a lot of entrepreneurs today, they think they need to start from scratch and invent or build something brand new, when really what they ought to be doing is looking at all the other successful businesses out there and finding out what they're not doing that the people who are buying from them might benefit from. So a really simple example would be the like the mobile phone covers, the protective covers. Usually, sometimes it is, but usually not. It's the case that another company makes those covers that go on the phone. And the only reason they have an opportunity uh, to do that is because they're fixing a problem associated with the phones, which in this case we're talking about fragility. Because as
Hmm.
they make the mobile phones more thin, they become more fragile. If you drop it without a case, oftentimes the screen will break. Well, if your core competency is making phones and doing the technology and all that, you may not be into making phone covers. That's an opportunity generated by your success, but it specifically comes out of the area of your success that has a little bit of a gap in it. And
Yes.
that problem, as it were, is what the other entrepreneurial, much smaller, maybe aftermarket or whatever it may be, they target that problem, they turn it into an opportunity, and they use their own unique, innovative processes to come up with a phone cover to sell. But they built on something that already exists. I think not enough entrepreneurs think about that. And that's probably the way it works out 90% of the time.
It's funny you should mention that as an example because I believe it's slated to be the next episode. We have Mike Watts on, and he's the founder of Love Handle. And they do all the handle, the cases that you hold the phone and you put your fingers on it, and it, you know, very popular stuff. And that's what he did. I also remember watching, and I don't know which, I watched these series, The Men That Built America and all this kind of stuff like that. And that's how Conrad Hilton, he didn't, the people who built the hotels for the workers who were on the railroad or the workers who were the miners, the people who opened restaurants, they made money off of what they were doing, just like you said. So you just have to look at it in modern terms, I suspect, and that falls right in line. Let's talk about sustaining and structuring a business. Now, from your perspective, what are the biggest reasons small businesses fail in the first 3 years?
In my experience, the number one reason that a small business fails in the first 3 years has to do with not properly delineating between an opportunity and an idea. These are two components that I mentioned earlier. I'll unpack them a little bit here and tell you what that means. So, you sense a problem in a market or a community, and you start living with the problem, and you collect some data around it over time. You begin to understand it. You turn that into an opportunity. You haven't really done anything creative yet. You don't create, as it were, an idea until you're very clear about what the opportunity is to do so. And then if you nonetheless try to formulate an idea to sell a solution without actually an opportunity to fix a problem, you're going to embed inefficiencies, operational inefficiencies into whatever you're trying to build. And if you forge ahead and launch anyway, you'll gloss over certain things that are important, and the venture won't evolve or grow naturally. in a way that makes it fit and robust to a dynamic environment. This opportunity and idea divide relates to so many different things that people talk about in entrepreneurship. For example, if you asked a practitioner that same question, a lot of them would probably say product market fit. Product market fit is a symptom. It is not a cause. It is a symptom of what I just said, which is the difference between ideas and opportunities.
Mhm.
An opportunity is external, it's objective, meaning you can show it to other people. An idea is opposite of that in every way. It is not objective, it is subjective, meaning in its earliest stages, when if you're not thinking about it, it has no meaning. It is like bottom up versus from the heart. Oftentimes when you come up with that
Yes.
new idea, it's highly personal to you.
Yes.
An opportunity is opposite of that. It doesn't come from the heart. It comes from the mind. You collect data about the environment externally, and then you rationally put it together. Well, markets are external and they're pretty objective. I mean, we can all look at a market and we can like argue about what it's doing or
Hmm.
where it's going, but the empirical immediate things that happen are objective. And products are on the idea side of that opportunity idea nexus. They are generated internally, they're created inside the firm, they're developed, they're formulated, they go through trial and error, they're subjective, they're imperfect, just like your ideas are when you come up with them. But just like a product needs to fit, I don't actually like to use that word fit. I think more in terms of harmony. But you talk about a product in a market configurationally like synced up with each other or fitting with each other. Opportunities and ideas do the same thing. And the reason it's better to think in terms of opportunities and ideas is because it relates to many other aspects of a business, including one we've already talked about, the artist and the business person. The business person deals with the opportunity side of things. They look externally, they're like the agent for the musical band. They look at the market, they look at what albums are selling, they look at what cities they need to go to, and they think about that. That's what a business person does. But the artist is on the idea side of that opportunity idea configuration. And they are usually the ones that come up with the new novel ideas for songs in the musical metaphor we're talking about, or they come up with new product ideas. They come up with new service ideas. That's oftentimes why the creator of a entrepreneurial venture, if it really, really grows and they bring in a professional manager, that person will often become the chief of product or something like that because they want to stay close to that creative element. So failing to delineate between what a real opportunity is and a strong idea is, and most importantly, how they harmonize with each other. In my view, that is the number one reason entrepreneurial ventures fail. It drives bad product market fit. It drives poor team building. It drives a lot of other kinds of strategic decisions that one makes as an entrepreneur.
So, how should new entrepreneurs think about creating sustainable business models instead of chasing short term wins?
Start with a real problem, like we were talking about, and talk to people about that problem. Find out if other people share that problem, feel that problem, and understand that it is a problem. Like the phones, for example. If nobody cared that their phone would break if you dropped it, if nobody cared about that, you wouldn't be able to sell any phone covers, right? They got
Correct.
to feel that that's a problem. That problem has to be real, such that people don't. They're not going to argue about it. They will only argue with you about your solution to the problem, but they will not argue with you about the problem itself. So starting with that as a startup entrepreneur is the best way to get into the mix, to build something that generates traction, and then building a team very intentionally, like we talked about earlier, and then innovating and formulating so that you build something that is capable of growing and evolving.
So, we talked about building a team. We talked about how critical the first 3 years of businesses are because a lot of businesses fail within the first 3 years. What role does formal business planning versus agile adaptation play in surviving the early stages of a company?
This is a great question. I'm not a big fan of business planning. I've had many entrepreneurs come through my program. Some are radically successful who never put a business plan together. I find that
Really?
business plans become, yes, I find that business plans become very important if you've already achieved traction and success and you become an acquisition target and you have a PE group or a VC firm or something like that that wants to look at this business and manage risk. Basically, the business plan is designed to manage risk and maybe even almost like a bank and their money, minimize risk. But if you start playing with risk like that, you will reduce the reward you can get because you do not get reward without risk. You need both. You need risk in order to get reward. So in those later days, and we can even extend our music metaphor, if you think of a band or an act that starts up, they're playing gigs, they're performing in venues, they're doing events, they sell albums, they write songs, they sell tickets, they sell merch, whatever it may be. They're already doing it. Everything is there that ought to be there. And at that point, typically is when a national outfit will come in and look at that and say, okay, we're going to make that 100 times bigger. We're not going to fundamentally change what's going on. We might tweak it a little bit, but we're going to take that moderately sized outfit and multiply it by 100. And a plan is often instrumental to that. In these early days of entrepreneurship, the way that an entrepreneur performs is much more in line with what we call general systems theory, meaning that there's a lot of uncertainty in the environment. There's a lot of purposeful actors, which can be partners, competitors, customers, potential partners, potential customers, potential competitors. There's a lot of potential. There's a lot of intention. There's a lot of endogenously driven activity, and it's a field of uncertainty. If you make a plan in a situation like that, forget about it. It's not going to be relevant. And so the logic of action in the domain of uncertainty is trial and error. In my field, we often call it effectuation or bricolage, but trial and error. You make not huge moves, you make moves in reference to a goal, a deliberate move in reference to a goal you have in your mind, but then you get the feedback. You want to get that feedback. You know what you do is not going to be a home run necessarily. It almost never is. It's going to have some error embedded in it, but it is that error that reflects an aberration from the goal that gives you a signal that you then use to tweak, to correct your path, to evolve, and to grow. It's a little bit painful, like growth is, but this trial and error is much more related to not planning, but it's more like a conjecture and refutation, kind of like the scientists that we mentioned a few minutes ago. And that was what really inspired me about entrepreneurs because I saw them doing that all the time. So for me, in the early stages, planning is not vitally important. It's much better to have a real problem that everybody can feel, an opportunity that anybody can see if you show it to them, but a world-class idea that only one person knows about in the beginning, and that's the entrepreneur. And then build a project around it and undertake these trial and error efforts until you
And
start getting
adapt as it
traction. And then,
goes.
yes, and you generate organic growth up until a point when, maybe if you become an acquisition target, then the planning aspect that you asked about becomes a lot more important.
Okay. How can founders leverage academic or research frameworks to strengthen their business foundation?
Good question. Any founder should, if they're really serious about it and they're in their city, they should reach out to their local or whatever nearby university in the business school, talk to the faculty about what they're working on, because what we have at universities is a universe of content behind paywalls and libraries that we can pull. And this is really good research on entrepreneurship and strategy and operations of entrepreneurial ventures and anything you can imagine. And we can pull that. And we want to write and we publish anyway. And meeting an entrepreneur is a great way to give us some guidance to think more practically about those things. But we can also answer a lot of questions. So that's one thing that an entrepreneur can do to engage with the research side of things. Another thing they can do, it's a little bit more indirect, but we do this at my program a lot. We're a very urban business school. We do outreach to the communities. So we do team-based outreach projects. We teach into the ecosystem, and any given class of 50 students will have like 6 or 7 entrepreneurial venture partners that the students are divided up into teams. And what they're doing is they're applying the theories and concepts and frameworks that they learn in our program to that business to help them work through any problems that they're trying to get through. And that is de facto an application of the research, the world of research. People shouldn't be down on research, man, in the entrepreneurial world. I know it's kind of fashionable to do that, but there is nothing more practical than a good theory.
Yes.
And practice without theory is blind. Theory without practice is pointless. I will grant you that, but practice without theory is blind. So reaching out to the universities for help is a great way that entrepreneurs can start to do that.
So, what financial practices should every entrepreneur adopt early on, even if they're bootstrapping?
We talk about this a lot. There's a lot of different ways to approach your finances in the early days as an entrepreneur. The way that we do it in my program is we do teach accounting and finance in our program, but it's a very basic approach to these topics. So they learn about term sheets, they learn about doing a deal. This is more from the finance side, and they learn enough about accounting to understand like the three principal accounting forms, like the income statement, the balance
Mm-hmm.
sheet, statement of owner's equity. They learn what those are and why they're important, but they don't learn to do accounting all day. What they really need to learn as an entrepreneur in the early days of a venture is how to know what they don't know, which means how to ask the right questions, which means now you're going to be able to have an intelligent conversation with an accountant. There are a lot of accountants out there that do contract work. They can have a fractional position in your firm. They could do a project for you, and if they fit with the vision or they harmonize with the vision and it works out, and they happen to be an accountant, that's great. They can join your team. But if you're an accountant already and you start something, then you're going to understand how to put things into their proper place with regard to good world-class accounting practices. And if you don't let that hold you back. Reach out. Again, I would go to a business school where they have a department of accounting, and they will have faculty members. They will have adjunct faculty members who are usually practicing accountants. They will have alumni. They will advance students, and you want to bring that perspective into your business. I can't tell you how many, man, I've seen a number, probably 10 to 20 over the years, entrepreneurs who don't do that. And even if they raise money, they don't talk to an accountant. They don't, and you got to like register this stuff. If you raise money, you have to file with the SEC. You have to do everything properly. And they think because they don't understand it that they're just going to go and do it anyway and figure it out later. And what we do in our program and the entrepreneurs we work with, we pair them early with accountants or with financial analysts or people who understand the world of finance, who can give them perspective and work with them. So that's the way to do it. But the thing is, that applies to marketing, that applies to operations, that applies strategy, that
Mm-hmm.
applies technology. You don't have to be the best in any of those areas as an entrepreneur. You have to know enough about them to ask the right questions and bring in talent when and where you need it, and then coordinate across the functions, which is very important for growth because that's what makes your venture organic. When the qualitatively different parts can coordinate with each other as needed based on what's
Yes.
happening in the environment.
Yes. Yes. Let's talk about mindset, strategy, and leadership. Now, you've taught many students who became entrepreneurs. What mindset shifts separate the ones who succeed from the ones that don't succeed?
It's a great question. I've had thousands, man, and I've thinking back on them right now. I was on the phone with one of them earlier today, who runs a $12 million business. He's 23 years old, and we were talking a little bit about this in the call. He's working through some pivots right now, and as I think about the others, a few things come to mind. So the first one is respect for mentors. And
Mm-hmm.
the reason it's important to seek out and actually really respect mentors, good mentors, is because they bring wisdom. Knowledge and wisdom are two different things. Entrepreneurs often have knowledge. They're an expert about the market or the community or the technology or the work, but knowledge is not wisdom. A simple example that we talk about sometimes when we teach this stuff, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. because it has seeds inside of it. Wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in a fruit salad next to the strawberries and other things. I mean, the person with no wisdom but knowledge only would say, "But it's a fruit. But it's a fruit," and they would insist. And that's like text without context. It's the definition of fundamentalism. It's you're zealous. You're zealot when you're knowledge without wisdom. You're naive, and a lot of entrepreneurs fall into that trap where they just get headstrong. And a great mentor will be the one who will give you the context around your text, saying, "Look, man, you don't need to go have a fight about a tomato in a fruit salad. It just doesn't work. It's not the way we do things." And it's a simple example, but you will have entrepreneurs that have a product that will have that same sort of headstrong attitude. And the ones who succeed figure out quickly that they need to listen to and seek out good mentors. Now, I say good very intentionally. Not all mentors are good. And sometimes mentors will just enjoy the fact that they are giving someone
Or,
advice, and they like the fact
yeah,
that that person is starting on and below them. And then when that person surpasses the mentor, the dynamic can change. They don't like that too much, maybe. A good mentor won't do that. A good mentor wants that mentee to be more successful than they ever were. So that's the first one. The good respect for mentors because of the wisdom they bring. Another one is curiosity. So we mentioned fixing problems. And if you're curious in general, you ask a lot of questions. Questions are essentially problems. We teach this in our program. You got to get around this like negative connotation around what a problem is. It implies something negative, but in a lot of world languages, the word for problem in question is the same word, the same exact word. So if you start to think of problems as if they're questions, a question calls for an answer, just like a problem
mhm,
calls for a solution. It changes your dynamic a little bit, and you're curious about the world and you're asking questions, but you're really dealing in
right.
problems and you're trying to solve them. So
Yes.
curiosity is another one.
So a friend of mine, he and I have a saying, and he was the first person I ever heard use it. He says, "We don't have problems, we have challenges, because
Right.
challenges you have solutions."
Right. That is right. So reframing how you think about problems. And if you're genuinely curious about them, you start to do things like get out of your comfort zone, which is important. And in the early
Hmm.
days when things are uncertain, like we discussed, that's going to be uncomfortable. You will be out of your comfort zone
Yes.
by definition if you're in an uncertain environment. Uncertainty is different from risk. Risk is when you know the range of potential outcomes that may happen, and you may be
Hmm.
able to assign probabilities to those different outcomes. So you can get like a probability distribution and then make a bet or something like that on the lottery or on a horse race or whatever it may be. Uncertainty, there is no range. You don't know what the outcomes are. It's you're much more in the dark about what may be going on. And that's when people and entrepreneurs and companies tend to resort back to who they truly are and what they're really made of. You want to see what someone's really made of, put them in a radically uncertain situation. If they're
Right.
if they're fearful, they're going to be afraid. If they're a negotiator, they're going to try and negotiate. If they run, they're going to run. If they fight, they're going to fight. Who they truly are comes out, and you want to get
The
into
true,
that,
the true essence.
the true essence, and then you'll get down to this. It basically you're comfortable getting out of your comfort zone if you're genuinely
Hmm.
curious about what's going on. One more thing that entrepreneurs, just really quick, in my view, is that, and it kind of contradicts what I said about mentors, because you should care what mentors say. But this one is, don't care what other people think. It's a superpower. Not caring what other people think is a superpower. You should care what your mentor thinks, but you're going to have people coming at you and not liking what you're doing. And if you take that to heart, it will it will steer you wrong. You need to stay true to that little small idea that you have in your heart or in your soul, and not care what people think. So a lot of great entrepreneurs that I've worked with, they have that.
I'm laughing because my wife and I were just having this conversation, and I the things you're mentioning is basically the mindset that I've adopted over the years. And I was talking to a group of people, and I was telling them, and this is in my book that I'm writing that's coming out in February. And one thing that you have to realize is that we're here to please God and serve people. You can't try to please people, because even if you try to please people, by default, there's another group that's going to be displeased because you can't please everyone. So if you're on a mission to start a company, you have to listen to advice that's practical and makes sense, and listen to the scope of what your customers are saying. But you can't listen to every idea that people give you, because you'll never get your business off the ground.
That's right. And a strong mission, like we talked about, it is kind of like the filter to know when you should say no. And with regard to not caring what other people think and people being critical or upset about what you're doing when you do disruptive entrepreneurial things, there's a great letter. Benjamin Franklin, a book of his collected letters, one of them way back when, I have this memory of it and I use it sometimes when we talk about these issues. He wrote a letter to his daughter, and his daughter was very upset because the newspapers were being very critical of what Ben Franklin was doing or whatnot, and she just couldn't believe it. And he wrote back to her, and he wrote, and I remember it because it hit me hard when I read it. He wrote, uh, as to the criticisms of my character that you mentioned, one cannot uh, apt to obtain the esteem of the good and the wise without drawing upon oneself at the same time the envy and malice of the foolish and the wicked. And the latter is testimony of the former. So, to your point, AB, doing these things that please people are going to displease others by default, but you need to understand that that energy, whether it be positive or negative, if it's negative, you can use it to develop or maybe improve your idea or evolve your idea.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's positive, maybe you can use it to make sales. But you should not do something because you receive that kind of feedback necessarily. Typically, actually, if your idea is any good, it's going to have that disruptive effect anyway. And there's going to be a
Right.
subset of people who don't like it. So you should view that as a kind of positive signal if you're doing something very early stage.
Yes, yes. How can founders develop strategic thinking without getting bogged down in analysis paralysis?
Building a team is one way to start to do that. So the thing about the artist, and if you bring on a business person to help sell your art, like if you're a founder, like a creative founder, and you eventually you're going to bring on a salesperson that kind of makes it intelligible to the world, you have a tendency to get into the weeds if you're the artist, because we're head down over the work. We're tinkering, as it were, with things that are in front of you, and you're working on the product to generate and produce and reproduce and transform resources. You lose sight of the larger picture when you do that. And so bringing on a team member that doesn't do what you're doing with regard to production and true generation of novel resources and products and services, but they look outside to the market and they look at the whole forest, whereas you're looking at the trees. And if that's going to be the case, back to our conversation earlier about contracting, make it clear that they are the one who will look at external markets and think about which is the best one to try to enter first and which one
Yeah.
second, and when do we enter the second market. You shouldn't do that. You should think more about the art and the work, and certainly you give them feedback on those kinds of things, but they should own those decisions, and vice versa. If you're the one that's like out there selling and trying to sell products and services, your programs or whatever it may be, let the ones who are making the actual product or designing the programs, give them feedback that you
Mm-hmm.
learn, but let them own that creative process. I don't think it's possible for one person to do both of those roles at the same time for very long. Eventually you're going to like hit a ceiling in terms of your development. The growth of your venture will eventually level off and fizzle out if you have one human being trying to be the artist and the business person at the same time. There are heavy team building implications around that particular topic. So the way to like think about the little things and the big things, or look internally but also have an eyeball on what's going on externally. I think the best solution for it is intentional team building.
Mm-hmm.
But another way to do it is to have a keen sense of the mission. It's probably not as practically effective as the team building part, but the original problem that you're trying to solve, It's like a compass, like staying true to that and not doing things that do not work in the service of working and solving that problem. Even if they make you money, don't let the mission creep get in there and get you off course. A, a good, keen sense of the mission based on the problem is another way to keep on track with regard to
So
that.
you talked about the mission, and you talked about how it's very instrumental and very important to the culture. So we're talking about leadership now and strategy. What are some leadership habits that help sustain company culture as the team continues to grow? It started out with two people, husband and wife perhaps, and it's four, and now it's 25 people. So what are the leadership habits you have to help sustain the company culture that you originally had as that company begins to grow?
Be able to articulate the values that define the culture. The definition of a culture in the way we're talking about it is essentially shared values.
Mm-hmm.
So and values have like positive and negative. They're kind of bipolar, meaning we believe it's good to do this or we believe it's bad to do that. Um, in the early days, when you try to fix a problem, we've already talked about it's going to be driven by your values as they relate to that particular problem. In fact, you'll only be able to see the problem if they clash with your values. Otherwise, you're probably just going to ignore it because we ignore things that harmonize with what we expect. But that initial problem fixing orientation will have values embedded in it and then articulate those, formalize those, uh, build statements around them, build your sales pitch around them, build nomenclature that the company uses to talk about its work around them. And then as you grow, the great thing about values is that there are many different ways to express any given particular value. And as your situation changes, including in terms of magnitude, you will find new ways to put your values into action. And that can keep the cultural alive. And as more people as more people join your team and you build that organization larger, they will come to the table with new ways to put those same values into action. That's a way to keep the mission fresh, but also use it as a kind of like a generator to drive the evolution of the venture itself.
Okay.
In our program, we're 5 years old in the Bearfield Entrepreneurship Program. We've raised $7 million and we've gone from 0 students to probably about 140. Since day one, we had 3 core values: impact, ingenuity, and inspiration, the 3 I's. So everything we do, even now, but same way we did in the beginning, we always try to put those values into a new program, a new class, a new hire, a new research publication, whatever it may be. And it has a way of keeping us on track and it helps us stay true to our culture and it helps you scale better. It aids in the scalability of your entrepreneurial ventures. So we practice that in our university program. And I think that's the way to think really strategically. These values that define a culture, they have the character of expectations about the future because you imagine them in action and you think about future scenarios, and if you have a keen sense of your values you'll know what to do when that time comes and you can imagine that, so they're future oriented by design.
That leads me to my next question. You talk about your keen anticipation of what the future may hold. That could be thought of as a vision, right? So, how do you recommend entrepreneurs balance their vision with their execution of their day-to-day responsibilities?
Be really curious and hungry for feedback. um,
Okay.
Most entrepreneurs I know, especially in the early stages but even later on, when they get somebody that tries their product or service, they always ask, "How was it? Is there any way we can improve it?" They're just hungry for feedback because they know that that feedback helps them evolve, it helps them grow, it helps them think strategically about where they need to get into the future. And so, by using feedback and seeking feedback, you're essentially generating business intelligence that you can use to think about the future, but it's also a form of information you can use to evolve your venture. And it's kind of opposite of the notion of a traditional plan. A feedback loop is circular. it oscillates. It's trial and error, it's conjecture and refutation. It's kind of that systems thinking approach that we were talking about earlier in the call. A plan isn't like that. It's a straight line. It's teleological, as we call it. You're talking
Mhm.
about where you are and where you're going to be and how you're going to get there. And if the environment radically changes, the plan becomes irrelevant. But in the former, in the trial and error, conjecture, refutation approach, if the environment changes, it's going to give you a different form of feedback that you're going to be able to use to evolve in a different way. If that deliberate goal that you have that gives the feedback meaning is front of mind, then the feedback will be more useful to you. And
Mhm.
then if your culture is strong and clear and well defined in terms of its values, you will know what you ought to do and what you ought not to do in relation to the feedback. So it's kind of like a interplay between the goal and the culture as a way to make the most out of feedback that you get. And then you just collect as much feedback as you can get, and you use that to stay on track, but stay hungry and stay evolutionary too.
So let's say you get feedback, and the feedback is so there's a consensus from those within the company and those outside the company. This is in the early stages. The question is, what's your advice for pivoting intelligently when things don't go as planned? You have to make a move.
A profoundly strong sense of culture and community. So we often say in my program that strong communities don't fail. And it's a rich notion and it's an important notion. If you feel like you're part of a strong community or a strong culture, it's like having a strong squad, man, and going out in the city on the evening. You and your friends, you just feel like you're part of a group and you go out into the world. There's a level of uncertainty there. A strong community has that effect. So if within your entrepreneurial venture, if there's a strong sense of community and purpose and values, and they bring you together, and you get crippling feedback, and everybody agrees that we shouldn't be doing that anymore, that's actually great, but it's not going to destroy the venture because the shared sense of purpose keeps it together. And because we're talking about a shared sense of purpose, which implies deeper values, and we've already said that a value can be expressed in multiple different ways. Like if you have a strong value for serving others, like we were talking about earlier, that may be a value, just like you believe it's good to do that. There are thousands of different ways to do that. And
Yes.
if in my case, if the value is impact, make an impact, whatever we do, it needs to make an external impact. Otherwise, we're not going to do it. If we do it one way and it doesn't work, let's find other ways to make impact. So you look within. It's like your compass, back to the culture and the values. If you receive that crippling feedback and you need to pivot, look to the culture, look to the values, and look at what they are, and then look back at the environment and find some other avenues or some other opportunities to put your values into action in a new way.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about building networks and ecosystems. Now, you've worked closely with incubators and innovation hubs. How can entrepreneurs tap into those ecosystems effectively?
I think entrepreneurs don't always think about networking in the right way. Now, nobody networks like entrepreneurs. I mean, a successful entrepreneur loves getting out and meeting people, and they never miss an opportunity to do that. And I think they naturally discover how networking really works. And in the early days, if one doesn't really understand the true power of networking, they won't do what's required to break into these communities that you're talking about. So the way to think about it, in my opinion, is to think in terms of indirect connections, not strong connections with others who are close to you, but weak connections with those who are far away from you. And the way that you connect with those people far away from you is through intermediaries. In other words, it's an indirect connection. And the reason you want to connect with others far from you is because the farther your energy goes out away from you, the larger the population out there is that can potentially bring something back to your entrepreneurial venture. And that raises the probability that the specific resource or solution you're looking for is going to get on your radar, or you're going to get on its radar. So if that's the logic of networking, it changes the way we need to network. The old way would be, I'm going to go to a networking event. There's going to be 500 people there. I'm going to try to talk to all 500 and see what each one of them can potentially maybe do for me. It's actually unlikely, man. You're going to run into the one person in that group of 500 who can help you. As crazy as it sounds, it's unlikely. And you will have spent a lot of time working that room. But if you think in the second way, the alternative way, which I would argue is the correct way, it's different, because now you go to that same event and your task is not just to really connect with a particular person in the room who may or may not be there. You want to make yourself memorable to each one of those 500 people if possible, meaning you tell them about what you're doing that's unique so that they remember what you're doing, and then they'll come away from that event and they won't forget about you. Then 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, they'll probably be at another event. There may be 500 other people there, but you won't be one of them. And then they will talk to somebody at that event who will say something that triggers their memory of you if you made yourself memorable. Because you may be looking for a particular material or a resource, and you talk to everybody, nobody really knows what makes yourself memorable. They may meet somebody who has it at a future event. This is that indirect connection that I'm talking about. So the task is to make yourself memorable to the people that you meet. So when they go out and meet others, those others will say something to them that triggers a memory of you. So it's not really who you know, it's who you know knows. It's not who you know, it's who you know knows. It's a second order network. And if that's the network structure that we're navigating, we don't want to make a direct connection with anyone. We want to make ourselves memorable to the people with whom we directly connect over time. And then eventually you get those unexpected introductions that can really help you out. But I don't think a lot of entrepreneurs really understand that logic of networking well enough.
So the University of Alabama, what city is that located in?
We're the University of Alabama at Birmingham. We're in Birmingham, Alabama. It's kind of like the Illinois system, AD, if you remember. Like we had UIC in Chicago, UIUC in Urbana-Champaign, and then UA Springfield. And then we have University of Alabama at Birmingham. It's like the UIC in Alabama. And then we have Tuscaloosa's it's a system. But yeah, we're in Birmingham, Alabama.
So the reason I ask that is because let's say someone wants to network, because people are listening to this and watching this from all different types of areas all over the globe, right? Let's say now we met in Chicago. I'm in Houston, huge cities, lots of people to network with. Birmingham is not as big as those two cities, but let's say someone's in another town and they're starting from scratch. How can they build a strong professional network from scratch, even if they don't know anyone, but they want to start a company?
We talk a lot in terms of thinking globally, but acting locally in our program and in my own work and in my publications. I talk a lot about that. You could be, Birmingham's like probably a tenth the size of city of Chicago. I had to reconfigure the way that I build things and the way I raise money and all of that when I moved there. But a lot of the same logic still applies. In Birmingham or in a smaller city, wherever you are, think globally, meaning your thought and your definition of what is a valuable connection should not be limited by the geographic boundaries that you're in. You can do things virtually. You can go to other places. You can go to events. If there's an event in your town that brings other people in from other places, that's where you should try to engage and think globally and act locally. Act locally is what a lot of people forget. That's also very important. So in a small town or a large town, it still applies. So in Birmingham, for instance, the action that you do as an entrepreneur, if you're going to start a business there, the performance that you generate needs to be denominated, as it were, in local currency. And that may be different from if you're doing a similar type of thing in another city, you might need to do it in a different way. So let's say we're solving a problem related to crime or education or transportation, you name it, in Chicago versus in Birmingham. It's the same problem. Um, and what we
Hmm.
research and what we look at, we may draw from all the same sources. That's global thinking. But the action we take, even though it's the same problem, to work on something like crime or transportation in Birmingham is going to be different. You will do different things than what you do in
Yes,
another city because the
of
local
course.
currencies. It's important that you act local because that also saves you from uh, well, if you think global, you gentrify, you force people out, all money's the same. You'll do business with whoever can pay the most no matter what. It's kind of like you transcend the local values and the local environment when you do that. But then on the thinking side, we just said it's important to think globally, but you don't want to think locally. You want to think globally. So the ideas that are within your sphere, your local sphere, and it could be geographic, it could also be demographic. You really want to extend your thought outside those boundaries and try to bring in some fresh ideas. And there are two ways to do that, to think globally. One way is we articulated it already, to be where you are, meaning you're in a moment in time, but you look to other places. You
Yes.
think across space. Um, that's one way. You can learn from Chicago if you're in Birmingham, or learn from Birmingham if you're in Chicago, or if you're in Houston, learn from LA or whatnot. You can do that. You're in a moment in time and you think across places. The other way to think globally is to be in one place, but think across time, meaning you study the history of where you are. So in
Okay.
Birmingham, for example, we have a rich history around civil rights and movements, and gosh, in the 60s, and 16th Street Baptist Church, there is a rich history around justice and justice related issues that you can learn in Birmingham by looking at Birmingham 40, 50, 60 years ago. That is a good way to think global because you're thinking outside of the time that you're in. You're not going outside the place, you're going outside the time that you're in. So there are different ways to think global to expand and improve the quality of your ideas. But again, when you do take action, when you execute, it is important, in my opinion, to boil it down to local action that makes sense locally.
Hmm.
And then if you get traction there and you want to branch out and go to another city, fine, open up a new location, but you got to tweak the model a little bit for whatever the local reality is there. And you can do that local action in different forms of local action without changing the way that you think globally.
Got it. Got it. You talked about mentors a little bit earlier in our conversation. How can an entrepreneur identify mentors or advisors who genuinely can add value to them?
Well, it's good to find one that has relevant experience, obviously. That's helpful. But I think the one thing I see sometimes is you want to pick somebody who's not going to be a competitor in any way. They should have got theirs already. They made it. They're not
Hmm.
looking for anything. They're not trying to get in or
Okay.
become part of your business, take out some equity or anything like that. No skin in the game, maybe a little soul in the game, but no skin in the game. So they can remain
Right.
truly objective, and they will be invested in your success for the right reasons, and they will not be, because if they become like a partner or something, their feedback is going to take on a different character. Like, you're going to lose my money. It's
Of
going to
course.
change the right.
Of
So
course.
that's
There's a
one thing.
conflict.
Yes, yes, they should be removed from what you're doing. Maybe they retired, maybe they've had their own exit, and they're just doing it for truly benevolent purposes. I think that's what makes a good mentor. University professors make great mentors because, like in my case, I'm a tenured full professor. I'm not trying to build a business. I have dabbled. I've had multiple businesses, and my wife has
Hmm.
a business now. But my core operational activity is all about academia, our classes, our research, and everything. And
Right.
so it's about serving other people. So university professors are good, retired individuals are good. People who have decades of experience on you can bring that wisdom, which complements your knowledge, like we talked about earlier, and you should have
Yes,
respect for that wisdom. So just look for that wisdom, years of experience, and have great respect for elders and people who have been around for a long time doing this. Like, I think there should be a deep kind of respect for those individuals and listening to their points of view. That's what a good mentor feels like to me.
I agree. I agree. Speaking of professors and universities, in your experience, what role do universities and academic institutions play in supporting local entrepreneurial communities?
They play a vital role. And this is another area where universities and research kind of get a bad rap sometimes in the entrepreneurship space, but it's really unfair and it's unfortunate. I've been doing this long enough to where I've had students come out and they've made millions and they're 15 years out and they come back with a kind of respect for what they received and what they gained from the university. And what they'll tell you they gained is an ability to think global because we pull in that research, we pull in concepts. Universities have a way of, um, like, I'm at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, but here I am talking with somebody from Houston. I get calls from all over the country, from all over the world, and we bring in those connections and the resources that come with those connections, the social resources and the attention and everything else to serve the students who are in the program. And so students get a lot of that exposure to knowledge and information far beyond their local realm in a university program. And they receive it from people who know how to deliver it in a way that will connect with them. And they receive it from people who are not competing with them and don't have like a financial interest in their success. It's all benevolent, educational in terms of that. The the other thing I'll say about the importance of universities with regard to entrepreneurs is that universities do a lot for their local communities. We have events that not only serve students, but they bring entrepreneurs and come who are coming in looking for talent, and they can hire people out of
That's
the
how we
university.
met.
That's exactly right. Exactly. And so, if you have a growing business, 80% of the jobs come from the entrepreneurial sector. You need to hire because you are growing. And if you're a growing entrepreneurial venture, you usually want to hire somebody that has an entrepreneurial mindset. And that's what a great entrepreneurship program is cultivating. And so we can place students with those entrepreneurial ventures, which that's where most of our students go, man. A lot of people show up and they're like, hey, you gonna turn me into an entrepreneur? I'm like, well, if you're ready, we can talk. And most of them aren't there yet though. So we train
Really?
them to be hireable by the entrepreneurial ventures, which is the best stepping stone to becoming an entrepreneur. Because most entrepreneurs I
Right.
know worked with or for another entrepreneur before they branched out on their own.
Yeah. Um, what are some networking mistakes you see entrepreneurs make repeatedly, just over and over again? They keep you like, wow.
They'll go to a networking event and think because they didn't meet anybody who can help them that it was a failure. That event,
Mm,
their attendance was a failure, but that's a mistake. You probably you think you just sunk the boat, but you actually missed the boat if that's how you're thinking about something like that. Because, like I said, you make yourself memorable to a lot of people, and word will spread, and their their thought and their memory of what you're doing will be activated when they connect with the real connection that you ought to be connected with. And so people don't really understand that aspect of networking. Another thing, I mean, it's kind of funny to think about, but a lot of people don't like networking events because they're shy or they're
mhm.
introverted or something like that. And it's hard to talk to people you don't know sometimes, maybe especially for young people, not all of them, but so we'll coach people on actually how to go to an event. And you can make a lot of little mistakes when you do this, but if you go to a networking event, you'll see people in the room. Some are in groups, some are by themselves. The ones who are by themselves are easy to engage. You can just walk up to them and start talking. It's harder to walk up to a group and kind of butt in. But
Right.
you'll get like a person like, oh my God, I gotta talk to people, I gotta talk to people. And they'll go to an event and they'll just jump into a group conversation. It's a little bit interruptive or something like that. And so whereas the individuals are easier to engage, you also have to think about disengaging because you want to talk to other people in the room. So The
Yes.
individuals are actually harder to disengage from, because at some point you have to say, uh, "Hey, I'm gonna go talk to some other people now." Or it's kind of like, it's kind of like a little bit of
Yeah.
a uncomfortable moment. But the group, whereas a group is harder to engage, a group is easier to disengage from. You can kind of duck out,
Hmm.
at the right moment in the conversation. So just thinking tactically about the social aspects of a networking event with little things like that are things people can use when they're first getting started.
Let's talk about growth, scaling, and innovation. At what point should entrepreneurs start thinking about scaling, and what indicators should they look for?
I think if you have to think about it, don't do it.
Really?
In other words, that's an important principle, I think, for entrepreneurs. You'll know when you need to take action. You won't have to think about it because you're already doing work that's rooted in a real problem. And a lot of that stuff is self-evident. But if you have an entrepreneur saying, well, I don't know, we might open up a second location, we might not. No, man, wait until you don't have to think about it. If you have to think about it, don't do it. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule. You might think about it for a long time and then do it, it might succeed. But if you're looking for a guiding principle, a lot of the stuff you need to do as an entrepreneur will become very clear to you very quickly. And if you're suitably alert and aware of the environment and your operations, you will see these things and know when and how they need to be done. So, to me, when I think about scaling and making decisions related to growing a business, that is a valuable principle to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind about growth is that it always generates waste.
Hmm.
This is true in the natural world. Trees shed their leaves because they grow. Snakes shed their skin because they grow. Um, Kids, uh, their clothes don't fit anymore because they grow. Dead leaves, dead skin, clothes that don't fit. These are all errors in the kind of natural social world. But in the entrepreneurial world, the same thing will happen when you make decisions around growth and in relation to growth, there will be errors generated by the growth itself. So having a healthy attitude about mistakes, errors, such that you can repurpose these things, like what happens in the natural world. Dead leaves fertilize the ecosystem of the forest. Same thing with snake skin. Now, there's probably some animal that eats dead snake skin. I don't know. Um, Clothes that don't fit a child anymore can be hand me downs to another child,
Yes.
or given to a child for whom they would fit. So the errors that come from growth can be repurposed,
Hmm.
and they're always repurposed in innovative ways that are germane to the notion of an ecosystem or a developing entrepreneurial venture. So understanding growth is vital to scaling. And human beings are very bad at understanding growth. We're just not trained or educated to think about it very intelligently at all,
Hmm.
especially exponential growth. And the reason for that is because we're educated to think in terms of like meaningful central tendencies and averages and symmetrical distributions of scores and different things
Exactly.
like that, like a bell shaped curve. And that's not the way the entrepreneurial world works. If you're average in the entrepreneurial world, you will fail. The distribution is not normal in the entrepreneurial world. It's more of what we call a power law distribution, where there are outliers far over to the right. And they're not errors, they're actually true scores that are meaningful. And then there's a whole bunch of failures that are over there to the left, things that didn't work out. But growth and the error of growth and the goodness of errors and the potential of errors to generate new things, like the post-it note started from an error. There are
Yes.
many examples of great entrepreneurial ventures that arose from mistakes. And then the last thing about growth, we talk a lot about growth in our program because you have to have a certain mindset in order to help something grow. You have to think in terms of potentialities and the power of growth. Um, like if you take a sheet of paper, it's like half a millimeter thick, and if you fold it once, it's 1 millimeter. Fold it again, it's 2 and 4. And we'll often talk about this in the seminar and say, well, how many times would you double it over before it would be thick enough to reach from here to the surface of the moon?
Wow.
And people are like, a million. hundreds of thousands. They have these huge numbers, but the answer is actually like 44. It's something like 44.2 or 43. It's a very low number. And that's surprising to people, but that's my point. Because we don't understand growth that well, things will grow on that order of magnitude, whether it's attention to your venture or clicks or person hours working in your venture or money. If you have the right mindset, they will take off that fast and they will radically and exponentially rise.
Speaking of growth, not to get too far off topic, a friend of mine, we were having a conversation, and he asked me, "What have you made grow?" And the answer was nothing. He said, "That's right, because all we can do is control the environment. Growth happens naturally, but what dictates the outcome of the growth is the environment." And this is so much interesting because it also, I'm thinking about what you're saying, and it applies to the business too. If you create a good environment, a good culture, you're going to have healthy growth. If you have a bad environment, bad culture, you're going to grow out of business. You're going to grow either way, but you can't control the growth. You just can control the environment.
Right. All growth, even the growth of knowledge, all of it occurs through the correction of error. So the errors that, dead leaves, dead snakeskin, clothes that don't fit anymore, all growth occurs through the correction of that. So you need new leaves, you need new skin, you need new clothes. It always occurs, but that's with your knowledge, that's with your company. And that gets back to the feedback mechanism that we were talking about earlier.
Exactly.
Trial and error, trial and error. You need the error for the growth. Growth does not occur without error.
That's
And
why
so
the
I think people
negative
don't.
response is not a bad thing, because you use that
Right.
to be better. Yes.
You need it. Yeah. I mean, a lot of entrepreneurs, they don't even care that much about positive feedback because they can't always use it as much as
Exactly.
the critical feedback.
So, how can startups innovate consistently without losing focus on their core offerings?
Strong sense of mission,
Okay.
values.
And we talked about that.
Yeah, put values into action. If you're leading a team, you want them, to your point about growth, you want them to take it upon themselves to take risks because you need trial and error in order for the company to grow. And you want that to scale up where it's not just you doing it, but it's other people doing it as well. You want them to try to do those kinds of things, but I don't think you can do it if you don't have a culture that values innovation. So part of your culture needs to value innovation and trying new things. And that has a way of keeping that hungry, innovative aspect to the word. And if you have a culture that doesn't value that or values it negatively, it's going to be harder for people to do that naturally. And at that point, you're like cultivating a garden, like you said. You're not, the way to make the plants grow in your garden is not to go over to the plant and grab it and pull up on it
Exactly.
to make it grow faster. That's going to kill the plant.
Yeah.
Instead, you don't touch the plant necessarily. You do things to the environment around it in order to cultivate growth. You don't command growth.
Yes. Because if I could make anything grow, I would be a lot taller. So we talk about growth, scaling, and innovation. What advice would you give for entering new markets or expanding product lines strategically?
Look for change. If things are reliable and routine in an environment, including the general environment, like you're going to look at economic aspects of the general environment. You can look at the natural world. You can look at laws. You can look at culture. You can look at legal and regulatory frameworks that are out there. And if those things aren't changing or if they don't have the potential to change, I wouldn't try to enter that space. You want to go to where there's change in emotion or you can see where change would occur. Same thing with the business environment, like competitors, customers, trends, um, whatever kind of partners that may be out there. anything moving and changing, it's important that you find out where the change is, because usually change is related to growth, change is related to problems. All these things that we're talking about kind of relate to one another in this context
Mhm.
of an environment. But look for change and then try to forecast where the change is going to occur.
Okay.
It's like that great Wayne Gretzky quote, great hockey player with the puck. Gretzky wasn't the biggest on the ice. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the fastest, but he was the best. And people asked him, "How were you the best?" And he said, I don't skate to where the puck is going to be. Or sorry, scrap that. He said, I do skate to where the puck is going to be. I don't skate to where the puck is. I
Okay.
skate to where it's going to be. That's how he answered that question. And then I heard a story. I don't know if it's true or not about that, but apparently this may not be true, but I have heard it about Wayne Gretzky. When he was
Let's hear it.
young, okay, he would watch hockey games on TV and he'd have a large sheet of paper in front of him with a pencil or a writing utensil, and he'd just watch the screen and he would trace the puck on the paper in front of him. You do, and hockey games are long, so you do that for 3 hours, you're going to get a pattern on that paper. And if you do that hundreds of times, watching hundreds of games, back when I talked about turning a problem into an opportunity, you turn a problem into an opportunity by collecting data
Yes.
and observing. And that's what he's doing. And
Mhm.
so if he can create or transform that problem, which we think of as a question, how are you so good? How am I going to skate to where the puck is going to be? He may have enough data and it may have developed a kind of schema in his mind for thinking about that. But as
That's
an entrepreneurial venture,
that
the same principle applies.
that's how that makes perfect sense, because they asked Dennis Rodman how was he so good at rebounding, and he says he's been studying the way the ball comes off the rim, at what angle, and he goes to where he knows the ball is going to be, whereas others not doing that. And so that's why he beats them to the rebound, even though he was only 6'8" and he was rebounding better than guys that were 7'2". So that makes sense to me.
Exactly.
Now,
Exactly.
how can entrepreneurs foster creativity in their teams, especially under pressure? Because you said you can't just
It's
make the plant grow by grabbing it. You can't grab it; that'll kill it. So, what's the
right.
trick? What's the key?
Well, a strong sense of purpose, number one, like we talked about, a keen sense of the values that describe and define why you do what you do. Um, that's inventive to genius. There's a million different ways to put your values into action and create new things. So that's one way to do it. A second way to do it, in my view, is to expand people's understanding of what innovation is.
Okay.
We talked earlier about extending an existing offering, like the phones and the phone covers. You can extend things that already exist.
Mm-hmm.
You can invent new things. You can even synthesize an environment by you don't really change, for instance, what's going on in an environment. You just change the way the different things connect with one another by maybe cutting out the middleman or making new sources of information about the same old environment and just reframe the way that people transact business in an environment. Like great example of that is it's been around forever. It's a really old case study. Calyx and Corolla. I think it's called Calyx Flowers now, but the lady who started that particular business, um, I mean, it's a floral industry, as I say. It's been around a long time. There are gardens where flowers grow. There are buyers of those flowers. There are floral shops. There are refrigerated cases in the floral shops. There are delivery services that deliver them. There are people who want flowers. There are people who buy flowers. All the elements are there. Um, what she did is she made an online marketplace where the growers are in the network. And then if you're the buyer, not the end user who's going to receive it, but the buyer, you go in there and you see what's available because the growers keep their inventory current online, and it's going to be a different inventory all the time. But you pick what you want, you enter the recipient's address, you pay for it. A message immediately goes to the grower. They package it in a particular way and they ship it directly to the end user, bypassing all those other elements,
Mm-hmm.
which And none of those elements are new except for the online marketplace, which was her idea. So she felt a problem in that, in the inefficiency of how that model worked, because time is an enemy to the core
Of
product, the
course.
flowers. And how can you reduce time through this online marketplace where you ship directly from grower to end? So she synthesized the environment, and there wasn't much added new. All the key components were already there. She just changed the way they interacted with one another. So really, and again, it probably comes from formal education, because like educating people about this can help. But if people really understand there are different ways to innovate, they had greater degrees of freedom to act in an innovative way when the situation demands it. If they just think they better invent something new, man, you're severely limited in terms of what you can do in an innovative way. That's all you
Exactly.
can think about.
Exactly. What are some effective ways to secure funding or partnerships without compromising control or vision?
Don't give out equity like it's candy. Um, be real intentional about that. And, good lawyers who understand deal structure can help advise about these types of things. I don't think we should ever do a deal like that without talking with an attorney to give you some perspective. Um, in terms of raising money and just attracting funding, two different ways to think about it. One way is conceptual, one way is practical. The conceptual way is, chasing money is not generally going to work. You, if you do good work, the money will chase you. If you do truly world-class work and really fix a problem, not a fake problem, and not just selling a solution and there is no problem, but really engage a problem in a unique way that adds unique value and makes a unique impact, the money will generally find you, especially if it's like investor capital.
Okay.
Investors are always looking for new potential investments. So that's the conceptual way to think about. The practical way, there are, and I coach a lot of people before they go and raise money or do a funding round. And there are 5 questions. And there's a good friend of mine in Chicago named Mark Calantes. He and I used to talk about this all the time when we would work with people here. 5 questions in the mind of an investor that they need to have answered before they can move forward. And they're pretty simple, but when you pitch to them, if you keep these in mind, it can help you, because you want to give them all the information that they need to answer these 5 questions. The first one is, who are you? Like not just your name, but your background, your experience, your education. In other words, the question is, who are you and why are you the one who ought to be leading this venture or performing a critical role for this venture? The second, third, and fourth kind of go together. The second one is, how much do you want? There should be a relatively specific ask when you raise money, but that alone is not enough. The third question is, how much do I get back? And again, this is from the investor's point of view. How much do I get back? The fourth one is, when do I get it back? So the middle three, 2, 3, and 4, how much do you want? How much do I get back? When do I get it back? You should give them enough information to piece all that together and answer those questions with an educated guess, or turn it into a risky bet for them. You're essentially turning uncertainty into risk for an investor as you answer these questions. Um, how much do I get back and when do I get it back? That's down to the stake we're talking about, but also the growth trajectory. Because if they park this much money with you and you're growing at this particular rate, they can make a calculus for how that may work out. So how much do you want? How much do I get back? When do I get it back? And then the last one, I don't think you can really answer is, as the entrepreneur, is, do I believe you? They have to answer that for themselves. Given who you are, what you want, what you're doing, how much you want, how much you're saying they'll get back and when they'll get it back, that's all fine. You need to give them the information, but to cinch the deal, to close the deal, they have to believe you. And that's the fifth question in the mind of an investor. Do I believe you? So it's, who are you? How much do you want? How much do I get back? When do I get it back?
And
And
do I
do I
believe
believe you?
you? Okay. Finally, here's the final question. What's one piece of advice you wish every entrepreneur would truly take to heart before starting their journey?
9 times out of 10, it's going to not work out the way that you expect. And rather than view that as failure, view it as a kind of error, which we talked about earlier. And if you have a true, strong, robust entrepreneurial mindset, that error, that is feedback that you'll be intrigued by. And if you can put boundaries around the costs associated with those errors, you can turn them into a discovery engine and give you new approaches and new ways to do it. So not being afraid of mistakes and not being afraid to be a little uncomfortable. It sounds like mom and pop advice, but when you unpack it, it's really not, because there are two different ways to make mistakes. Most entrepreneurs don't even think of it this way. We mentioned earlier briefly, sink the boat and miss the boat. You can sink the boat by taking action when you shouldn't take action, or you can miss the boat by not taking action when you should have taken action. The former one is much better.
Why is that?
It's better to sink the boat because you still have a fighting chance to plug the leak, and you're
Okay.
already underway. And that plugging the leak looks like innovation and entrepreneurial activity. If you, by contrast, miss the boat, it's gone.
Yeah.
You can't do anything. You can't swim out to it. You can't. It's gone. No matter what you do, it's gone. But if you're on it, and then it turns out to be a problem situation, you still have a fighting chance to do something with it. So it just a little thing like that, for thinking about how we make mistakes, it forces you, if you embrace that logic, to put yourself into this, what we call a ready, fire, aim mindset, where you do prepare, and you prepare to go to war, or you prepare to make amends, or you prepare to fix problems, and you prepare to deal with mistakes. You get ready, but then you take action, knowing that you're going to need to aim or correct the aim after you take action.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you correct the path after you take action, and that gets us back to growth. Growth only occurs through the correction of errors. So you have to take action, and then to the degree that the action aberrates from the eventual goal you want to achieve, you correct it and you innovate in relation to that. So
That's
ready,
the
fire, aim all the way.
That is the same business philosophy that Amazon uses. From being a operations manager with them for half a decade, I used to wonder why they do it like that. And they said, because this way it doesn't stifle growth.
Yes, 100%. They are a great case, and they are they're huge, obviously, but they are an example of a company that's managed to stay small in many ways as they become huge. I think it's because of the way they're distributed and the way they have all these different partnerships. And then, of course, and as we talked about, they have a culture that embraces ready, fire, aim. And so you want to stay small as you get big, so you stay hungry. If you get so big, I mean, you may be, as a company, you may be powerful, but the environment is always going to be more powerful than you. And if the environment shifts in a way that you don't expect, when you're big, it takes a long time to turn a ship.
Right.
If you're an armada of a bunch of smaller boats that are all in coordination with one another, it's much easier to pivot when you need to.
That's true. Dr. Murphy, thank you so much for joining us today. Your insights into entrepreneurship, from those early steps to building networks and scaling, are exactly the kind of knowledge entrepreneurs need to hear. And for everyone listening, this was the Business Advantage series, and this is what it's all about: bringing in experts who can give you the tools, strategies, and perspective to help your business grow stronger. We'll be featuring more of these special episodes throughout the year, each one focused on a different area that's essential to your entrepreneurial journey. And if you found this conversation valuable, please make sure to follow the show on your favorite podcast platform, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, and share this episode with another entrepreneur who could benefit from it. Until next time, keep innovating, keep creating, and never stop unveiling the innovator in you. I'm your host, A.D. Edwards, signing off.
See you next time.